suppose we can start right now. It's 7:05. So, Venkatesh sir, sir, can you hear me? Am I audible?
Hello.
Hello, sir. Am I audible? Yeah, I'm audible,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah, absolutely.
So,
Yeah,
we can begin now. I
sure.
think more and more people will join. We also uh, uh, telecasting it through YouTube. So, YouTube Live is also there. So, let's
Okay,
begin. Yeah, yeah.
okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, is there
Yeah.
anything, any formality, or do we just start talking or what?
Yeah, there is a bit of a formality,
Yeah,
not
please.
much. Then
Yeah,
we can move on to the
sure,
lecture.
sure.
Yeah, okay, sir. So, good evening, folks. എല്ലാവർക്കും നമസ്കാരം. This is our second talk of this year. Uh, and I welcome you all to this gathering. നമ്മളുടെ രണ്ടാമത്തെ ടോക്കാണ്. And if you remember correct, our first talk of this lecture series was about NEP, which was delivered by our ex-MP, Dr. P.K. Bijou, in the last October. It's almost 6 months that we have heard about it through a lecture, and which was quite enlightening at that point because we were politically quite charged regarding the changes that are about to happen in the field of higher education. As teachers, as students, we were quite concerned. After so many months, uh, when we are revisiting the very idea of this policy, it's becoming a law, and we are still quite confused about the implementation process, the pros and cons, mostly issues that we need to address before we actually get into a new methodology of education. And that's the reason why we have actually invited Dr. Venkatesh Athreya, uh, the famous economist, social activist, a chemical engineer turned an economist who has had his higher education in United States. Then he came back. I have circulated the history of his activities among our students and our colleagues. But I think apart from that, we also need to know that somebody who has been constantly working, especially on the field of education, uh, he can give us a better idea of what it would be like, especially when we are moving forward, moving towards the kind of uh, you know extraordinarily highly capitalized society where education is a profitable business, or it is treated like a profitable business. uh, so he has been working along with the left democratic movement in India. That's another reason why he's being invited here. Apart from his scholarship, he is also a co-traveler for us. So um, he has also given a beautiful introduction, or let's say a commentary of the Capital first volume that I've just seen, but haven't had the opportunity to read it. So he has that background that we most of us are sharing in terms of understanding justice and equality, equal opportunity, and social justice. I think he's somebody we need to listen to. And in his profile, as you know, that he is somebody who works with the literacy movement in Tamil Nadu. He was executive member of the same body under the government of India. He has been conducting rigorous research on this field. He has been chairman to various committees. Various reports have been produced in collaboration with his colleagues and him. He was somebody who also worked in Kerala before he moved on to Hardidasa as part of CDS. Our ex-minister was part of CDS. Our economist like Prabhat Patnaik is being contributing to the left-oriented economics for a long time, and he is one among those scholars who has been talking uh, with the same conviction and ideology. In that sense, he is somebody we need to listen to, and that's the reason why he's here. I welcome him. Uh, to our program. Before that, I would like to welcome all AKGCT leaders from state level to our district level, especially our district secretary, state committee, treasurer, secretary and president, all our AKGCT members, members from our unit, our president, Dr. Anil sir, our other members who is holding a higher position in our district committee, our district secretary, Dr. Mr. Sushant sir, and Satin Marsh and Manoj sir, our secretary and president of state level AKGCT, have promised us to join in, and we are expecting them also. So a very warm welcome to all of them. All our well-wishers, other scholars, teachers, students, all of you, we welcome you all, and please join us to listen to what Dr. Athreya has to say. Thank you, sir, once again for agreeing with us to come and give a lecture. Without much ado, please, I'm handing over to you the
Yeah,
metaphorical.
thank you. Is the audio good enough for people to hear? Is it clear?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. It's
Yeah,
it's it's
yeah. Let me begin by commending this initiative on the part of Vinny and her team as part of AKGCT to organize this webinar. These are difficult times. Very difficult for us to suspend, you know, what we know about the reality around us, and then sit and listen to a talk on any topic for that matter. So I'm glad that despite the difficult circumstances in which we all find ourselves, almost every morning we look at the I find my old friend, well, young old friend Alice there. It's almost as if we don't want to open the pages of the newspaper because someone has left us and so on. So under these very difficult times, I'm impressed that you've been able to mobilize such a large number of people under the auspices of the Kerala Government College Teachers organization. I've had the pleasure of meeting AKGCT activists earlier also on a couple of conference occasions. Now, we have now what we have with us now is not the old, rather bulky document of the new education policy, which was there a year and a half ago, and which is what I have written about. And I've actually put the video and the lecture on Facebook page. So some of you may have seen that. What we have now is a different document. It reads more like a vision document and has a lot of nice phrases. It's actually a brilliant response to stinging criticism all around without changing anything in substance. So it's got a lot of nice words, and who can disagree with all the nice words they use? But in terms of its content, there are three features of the new education policy draft document that I criticized, and I think those criticisms still remain valid. And those 3 points were the following. I said, first of all, that this document envisages a huge degree of centralization of education across a completely diverse and large territory like India, which has so many languages, so many cultures, so many nationalities, so many diversities. But we have a regime which is not at all happy with the diversity and pluralism of our country, but seeks to reshape the country in a very homogeneous manner according to its own, visions. Have been articulated right from the days of the early RSS leaders. Quite horrifying if you go back and read some of those materials on what kind of India they envisaged and what they thought was the place of Muslims and minorities in this country. But leaving that aside, what you find, what I did say then, is that there is a huge degree of centralization. More or less, marginalizing the states. They have to be brought in at some point, so they are brought into this new document and towards the end by saying that the states will also participate in implementing these policies, but not in formulating them, not in designing them. The partnership is talked about, but in terms of actually carrying out things. So what is huge centralization? And that is repeated in the vision document. They have they have one overarching body called Higher Education Commission of India. Small body, they say. It's not clear, earlier they had a clear delineation of who would be in it, and basically the bureaucrats and the ministers of the union government. who were to be there. Now it's not clear what the composition is not spelled out in that particular policy document. It may come later when they formulate a legislation for this purpose. But at the moment, that centralized body remains as key to designing and implementing the changes envisaged. So, Higher Education Commission of India, within which there are four verticals, they say. One will take care of regulation, one will take care of accreditation and assessment, one will take care of financial matters, and one will take care of standard setting and academic aspects. But the whole framework is very highly centralized. It is, in fact, go back to the UPA 2's disastrous attempts to impose such a highly centralized framework. I remember Kerala Higher Education Council had organized a seminar in that respect. I had been there. We had all discussed it when Comrade M.A. Baby was the education minister. And we had taken a very strong stand against such centralization even then. But this vision document has a lot of nice words, as I said, through most part of it. And then towards the end, when you come to how do they plan to implement this, the bureaucratic bodies that they are proposing are just the same. Higher Education Commission of India, Higher Education Regulation Council, Higher Education Assessment, National Accreditation Council, or Assessment Council or whatever, and then they have finance body. UGC has gone, but Higher Education Grants Council has come. Essentially, the other point I had made was, for a country of India's size and diversity, this centralization would be terrible. Remember also that until 1975-77, the unfortunate period of emergency declared by Mrs. Gandhi in the wake of the Allahabad High Court judgment against her on grounds of internal challenges to rule. This, until then, education was in the state list. During the emergency regime, when from 1975 to 77, when civil liberties were curbed, education was moved to the concurrent list. Now, the present government's draft document and the current national policy of education reflect a further progress in this direction of centralization, where it literally becomes union list rather than concurrent list. There's practically no say for governments in all that is being discussed in the document. Very important to see that, because the state governments come in only at the very end in terms of how will this be implemented, and we'll take, we'll have to work with state government and so on. But they're essentially implementing bodies. They're not bodies that have contributed to the legislation or to the vision underlying the document. So a further step down the road from state list to concurrent list to literally union list. Now, this is not new. This, we are sitting here discussing this matter after about nearly year and a half with the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. We have seen enormous centralization in these 17, 18 months in practically every sphere. We've seen how state government was stymied in their efforts to implement local specific measures, including graduated lockdowns in the first phase, when there was a 4-hour notice given for a nationwide lockdown with no regard for regional diversities or local situations. Then we have now a situation where state governments are being asked to handle issues, but at the same time they're hardly in a position to meet the financial challenges that a pandemic like COVID-19 represents. And this is something I'll come back to. I'll come back to the issue of finance, very, very critical to us towards the end. But again, the tenor of the document, the tone and tenor of the document is consistent with the centralizing philosophy of the Modi government. And it's extreme centralization. You want to give a couple of examples. Take a decision like demonetization. Take a decision like, the vaccine policy. Where was the consultation with states? Where was the discussion at any level? So this is extremely unfortunate for a country of India's diversity and plurality. We are a country of, I would say, at the risk of inviting Section 124A, that we are a country of several linguistic nationalities who've chosen to come together in the Union of India. The Union of India is the union of states, as has been repeatedly mentioned in recent times. It's not the union that makes up the states, it's the states that make up the union. And yet, in the whole overall scheme of things, you know, take a country like the United States, it is, you know, of course, almost advanced capitalist countries, but it's got enormous decentralization. The state governments do have considerable powers in the US. And yet, we have a GST. The US doesn't have a GST of the kind we have. We have a GST where the state governments do not even have the power to alter the rates of taxation on commodities, because they want the whole notion of one country, one tax, which is not true, by the way, because they have a whole set of taxes, tax rates, a whole range of tax rates, but essentially depriving the states, which, by the way, state governments, do not forget, are all elected governments. So they have a significant element of popular sovereignty in being elected governments. And, you know, after all, we've had historically great battles in democracy over the issue of no taxation without representation. But here are elected state governments unable to tax the populace because of the GST, and they have to go to the GST Council, which is, of course, manipulated by the government of India. So the state governments have had to surrender the taxation powers. But just, you know, promises about how GST will grow in the future and enhance the revenue, and for some assurance of compensation, which has not been upheld, it's not been adhered to in the last 2 years. I mean, again, I'm giving examples, not strictly in the field of education, but we have a government philosophically committed to enormous centralization, and is reflected in the education policy document as well. I'm talking about the new document, which is more of a vision, as I said. The second point I had made in my earlier critique, which still stands valid, I think, is this element of communalization. Now, this, of course, not so much per se in higher education alone, but also right from school days and so on, notions of values. In fact, very interesting, there are a number of references to the constitutional values. And yet, very carefully, secularism never figures as part of constitutional values in the entire document now, or the bigger, more bulky document of the earlier period. And that is not an insignificant omission. It's a very deliberate omission. You use other terms. You talk about pluralism, maybe you talk about dharma, maybe, whatever that might mean, and so on. But you don't talk about secularism. Okay, it's a Supreme Court may have said it is a fundamental structure of the Constitution, but this regime doesn't believe, evidently, that it is, and would rather avoid using the term, because for them, what we call secularism is identified with something that they used to call pseudo-secularism. So it's a real, you know, this document is not an innocent document. It's a document that embodies a certain vision of education. So the closest phrase that describes it would be corporate Hindutva. That's really essentially the essence of the philosophy that inspires this document. Why do I say that? Because apart from centralization and communalization, which I've referred to, there are plenty of words and paragraphs and passages that will tell you exactly what that means in the document. It's not obviously very crude. It doesn't say Hindu, Muslim, and so on, but it pretends that there are just only Indians, and you know, there are no disadvantages for population based on origin of birth or religion or whatever. It does talk about something called SEDG, socially and economically deprived groups, but never cares to define it. So, you know, it's a very careful exercise. And the third element of this document, which, as I see as something that I'm worried about, is, of course, the accent on commercialization. So, interestingly, the vision, or the document we have now, the National Policy on Education, is very strident about how we cannot allow commercialization of education. But all it does to deal with that is to say that all these private higher education institutions which exist shall publish on their website the financial details of how the institutions are run. It doesn't say that there must be zero profit institutions. It does talk about the role of philanthropic private institutions. So there's been some impact on the document and its wording in response to criticisms of the kind that many of us made. But I don't think that it is a substantial change in the orientation of the document. You have to read document yourself fully. I can't summarize it in the short time we have. But it's clearly to me, all these three elements of the critique which I have made publicly earlier and which I have today, as I said, posted on FB, those three critiques, that it is A, centralizing, B, communalizing, and three, commercializing. Those remain valid, is my view of the document. Even the revised national policy document that we have, which is a much slimmer document, about 60 odd pages, so one can definitely read through it. Now, the title we have given for this lecture is NEP and the Future of Higher Education in India. It's a very grand, rather sweeping title, I'm afraid. But, we have this culture where titles are somewhat sweeping to attract audiences. But obviously, the competence of each individual speaking there will be limited to whatever he or she is particularly specialized in. So I can't really talk about everything under the sun under education policy. And today, in particular, we have decided to limit ourselves to higher education. There, the national policy on education has some interesting things to say on financing. It does make the ritual statement that 6% of GDP should be the public spending on education. The earlier document didn't even say public spending; it just says spending. This one is an improvement. It says public spending on education by Government of India and the state governments together should reach 6% of GDP. Now, you will recall this is an ancient promise. The 1960s Kothari Commission. I mean, I'm sure that people in AKGCT must be tired of hearing Kothari Commission again and again. We've been talking about it for as long as I can remember, from the time that we had very powerful college teachers movements in the 80s and 90s. And I almost feel ancient recalling those several decades ago. But what did Kothari Commission say? It said we must spend 6% of GDP on education. Public spending on GDP by center and the union and the state governments put together should come to 6% of GDP. For me, there's nothing sacred about 6%. Why 6%? You should actually be saying whatever it takes to make sure that every citizen has a right to education of a level and content that she or he desires. That should be the commitment of society to education expenditure. But obviously, that's not even a starting point. So 6% is some arbitrary number that the Kothari Commission came up with. But have we ever reached it? Much later in 2004, when the UPA government came into office with support from the left parties based on a common minimum program, which is of the UPA's making, not of the left's. But the CMP actually said, what later became the National Common Minimum Program, also said that we shall raise spending on public spending on education of the government of India and all the states put together to 6% of GDP, and that on health from the current less than 1% to something like between 2 and 3%. Now, neither of these promises have been realized. It's now at least 17 years since the UPA government made the promise. And of course, this is something common to neoliberal regimes. Neoliberal regimes do not believe the state should invest significantly in health and education. They would rather try to convert every field of human activity into a potential profit-making activity. That's the whole logic of neoliberal policy. That make an activity potentially profitable, that will incentivize investment. Investors will rush in to take advantage of this, and the state does not need to do anything except maintain law and order and make sure that the workers do the work and don't form unions and go on strikes, and all democratic rights remain in a state of clear suspension. This is neoliberalism, in other words, is incompatible with a genuine active democracy. But we have had neoliberalism for a long time. What is new that has been added by this regime is what I have called corporate Hindutva. So there is neoliberalism, but there is also Hindutva firmly linked to it. And of course, the spectacle of the Indian big business classes, once proud participants in the freedom struggle, today applauding a Hindutva-led regime in the manner they do, is of course instructive in itself to see the direction in which Indian polity has been going over the last several decades. And this is something that should concern us in the field of education. What's happening? Why is it that a country which was committed to a modern secular path of development, somewhere along the line moved in this direction? Of course, you may say it's a global phenomenon, and post-1991 collapse of the Eastern European and socialist countries, there was this, Kina hypothesis, no, there is no alternative and so on, you fall in line. But this regime has taken it to a different level altogether. It's not only done neoliberal policy, it's also done demonetization and done a completely badly designed, hastily implemented GST. It continues to do incredible things, which are not even in the neoliberal rule book, okay? And now it says suddenly in this document, this is the point I started out with, coming back to that. Yes, somehow we'll find money for 6% of GDP to be spent on education. Now, this is hardly a credible claim that they will find the money. How will they find it? If you take, and I will not treat you to a lot of economics, but some economics is unavoidable in a discussion of educational policies, because at the end of the day, you can have fine words, but ultimately the allocations, where do they come from? What is the, put your money where your mouth is, so to speak. Where are your numbers? Where are your financial parameters? Now, if you look at the situation here vis-a-vis education, for higher education has been particularly a sad case. They hardly ever received more than 1% of GDP as funding in all these years. And state governments do the bulk of the spending on teachers' salaries and so on. Government of India does relatively much less on higher education expenditure. Together, they still do very little. That's the reality that they have. But if the document itself says, although we made this promise about 6%, the highest we would get is 4.43%. And yet suddenly they say we will somehow do it. And so how will they do it? Well, it's not clear, but if you read between the lines, they think philanthropy might come to the aid. No, philanthropy can't contribute 1.5% of GDP. Now, what have we been doing for the last 7 years? We've been reducing the corporate tax rate almost on a daily basis. India's corporate tax rate, how many of you are aware of this, I don't know, has come down from somewhere around 37% or whatever it was, 30% plus surcharges and all that. This is a flat 22% tax rate on corporate sector profits. This was the announcement that was made in 2019, latter part of 2019, and early 2020. In 2020 February, in the budget, President Finance Minister was also then the Finance Minister, announced a dramatic, before the budget, she announced a dramatic reduction in corporate tax rate. This followed a number of other initiatives. You may recall that when this government came back to office in July 2019 for a second term, there was very quickly a sense of crisis with the industrialists declaring that there was no purchasing power, automobiles were not being sold, cars were not being sold, even biscuits were not being sold. This is the cry from the corporate sector, and the government response was to provide a series of concessions to the corporate sector. First, there was the concessions for the export sector, 50,000 crores, another 25,000 for housing and real estate. Then the 10,000 crore that came first, which is to remove the surcharge on capital gains taxation on the stock markets for foreign portfolio investors, your key allies, of course. And then you had in the budget itself, you had this whopping 1.45 lakh crore tax concessions to the corporate sector when you reduce the tax rate from 30% plus to 22% flat. You also said enterprises started after October 2019 will attract only 15% tax rate. And then in the budget, you gave another 65,000 crores of direct tax concessions. So essentially about 3 lakh crores were handed over as tax concessions to the corporate sector and the super rich in this country in the course of this 8 months from July 2019 to Feb 2020. And I'm talking about the period before the pandemic. So the slowdown preceded the pandemic, and the state's response was to shower the corporate sector with concessions. Remember further, I'm saying this only to refresh your memory, remember further that this came on top of an earlier 2017-18 budget, if I remember right, which abolished the wealth tax in this country. It also had tax provisions which said that if companies are having an annual turnover less than a certain amount, the tax rates will be lower and so on. So this has been a series of efforts to basically incentivize the corporate sector in the hope that they will create jobs, invest and so on. Hasn't happened. Now, when you're having that set of taxation policies, fiscal policies, where will you find the resources for 6% of GDP to be spent on education? That's where the link is. You see, you must be wondering, why is this guy talking about the economy? He's supposed to talk on education, right? Well, one can make fine statements about education. One can talk about the most wonderful principles of pedagogy. But even on that, the document fails. That's a different matter that I'm not taking up now. But I think this is Paul Baran who once said this. I don't know, the late American Marxist economist, Paul Baran, who's written a brilliant introductory book for all of you who are not even in economics. You should read his Political Economy of Growth from the 1958 edition or 62 edition. He once said that whether there is meat in the kitchen or not is not decided in the kitchen. It is there in the economy. As a household, they have income to buy meat. Likewise, what happens in the sphere of education is not decided in declarations of education policy by governments. It is decided in terms of the resources the governments are able to mobilize to finance education to the extent that their professed commitments require them to. And there in India, we've had a series of, experiences which show that governments or not, and state governments, to be frank, really cannot carry this burden. Their finances are so badly strapped, especially post GST. They have lost their power of taxation. So essentially, unless you reverse neoliberal fiscal policies and return to a regime, or create a regime, not return, create a regime where there can be effective taxation of the rich, not punitive. Nobody is asking for punitive taxation, but your tax rates are lower than anywhere else in the world. In fact, your tax rate is the same as Trump's rate. Trump was the one who reduced the US tax rate to 22%. And poor Biden is having a tough time trying to get it back to 28%, let alone going 30 plus. So, we really have this, behind all the rhetoric on education lies the economy. And unless economic policy of the state commits itself to mobilizing resources to fund education and healthcare, which is particularly relevant today after we've had this disastrous experience with COVID-19, I don't see that the new education policy will remain anything more than a document and a statement of intent at the level of implementation of its financial commitments. On its substantive commitments, leaving aside finance, they are much more worrying because they commit themselves to a rather, linear notion of education. They have these nice and fine words, autonomy, institutes have to do, institutions will be allowed to develop their own courses and syllabus and all of that, but all subject to some framework. And then suddenly UGC produces a syllabus for history, right? And everybody has seen the UGC syllabus for BA history and MA history. It's laughable. I mean, it's completely, the entire intent is to eliminate the earlier commitment to a broad-based view of India's history and not classifying it along religious terms or communal terms, but looking at it in terms of the material evolution of Indian society. But now we have a new dispensation that says that no, you cut out all that bit about the medieval period and all that. Let's just have the great and glorious ancient India. And this document, NEP document, the one that is now on their website, the 2020 document, is just full of encomiums paid to the wonderful systems of education in ancient India. No, this completely beats me. You talk about Takshashila, Nalanda, but tell me, as far as I know, through most of India's history, or through most of the history of the territory that we now call India, a majority of the population has always been denied access to formal education. You may have had a university where the elite studied, but you cannot claim that the caste system did not exist. You cannot claim that it did not push people into particular occupations by birth, and so on. So this notion that pre-British India had wonderful systems of education which the British came and destroyed. To some extent, I think Mahatma Gandhi contributed to some of this myth in this beautiful tree and all that. But Dharampal talks about Gandhi's vision and all that. I personally believe that pre-British India, there may have been exceptions here and there. By and large, the territory that constitutes India today was characterized by exclusion in education as well as in other spheres. So, without romanticizing pre-British India, we have to go forward, not back. But this whole document at several places, they keep saying something which just baffles me. They say, this great Indian critical tradition was there. And what the world is doing now in the big, famous universities Is what we were doing all these years, and we lost it somewhere. So now we must regain what India gave to the world. This tendency to claim everything as India's gift to the world, it's sad actually. It's a reflection of one's insecurity. You should be proud and confident as a nation that you fought imperialism and won your independence, and you're building or you're trying to build a relatively self-reliant society. But you want to hanker back to an ancient past where you taught the world everything. I mean, every country can start saying that. Every culture can start saying that. It doesn't get us anywhere. So this document again repeats all those things. Through much of this document, you find great, glorious ancient India, and that is not particularly healthy in a document of this kind, which has to be much more concrete and much more inspired by a vision for the future. It is not clear. For example, okay, I'll tell you one or two more things. There's centralization. It's not just the fact that a small council at the top tries to decide for all of India with a couple of three or four verticals inside it. It's also that the notion of higher education will now be, one where large institutions exist, which means that you have to have, say, several thousand students, even in your standalone colleges. They say they allow for standalone colleges for some time. They say that some of these colleges can either be part of an affiliating, well, the affiliating system has to go in the understanding of the document. There can be constituent colleges of universities, which are part of the university, and there can be standalone degree granting institutions. This may take some time, but that is where we are going. And what are they saying? They're saying these degree granting autonomous standalone colleges must have some 15,000 students. Now, what does this mean for the education of a Dalit child or a girl child in rural India? Which parent will send a rural girl 100 kilometers to study? And you remember, these are complexes. They're going to start from preschool onwards into these big integrated complexes. And how will this kid go for higher education 100 miles from their native place? Today we have colleges scattered all over the country, uneven quality, I agree, but this whole notion that they will centralize the distribution of higher educational institutions. Although they now say in the policy education document now that is on the website, they say that we by a certain date we will try to ensure that in every district will have at least one institution which is higher education institution with diversity and large numbers of people and so on. But a district, we should not be moved by notions of districts in Tamil Nadu and Kerala. District in, I remember one time that the Midnapur district had about 1 crore people, right? Humongous district. We think of districts in UP or elsewhere. So, district is a very large territory. We are a country of, a very large population, right? Much larger than all of Europe put together, right? And why don't we have more and more decentralized, community-based higher education institutions? And then the question is raised, but how do you control quality? How do you regulate it? So you need to minimize the number of institutions so that you can regulate quality. But this notion of regulating quality of higher education institutions sitting in Delhi is something I find very unrealistic. And fundamentally also very undemocratic. First of all, language is a crucial element of education. Higher education in the mother tongue, in what unfortunately they call local language, which is quite annoying when I read that. In India's national languages would make more sense. All these languages are part of India's 8th schedule, right? I don't want Tamil called a local language, no more than you would want Malayalam called a local language, right? So, terminology apart. If you want democratic education structures, teaching must be in the mother tongue, even in the higher education sector. In which case, I think the entire administration, the regulation, the monitoring, all of that has to be at the state level. Education in a country of India's size must remain a state subject, not a concurrent subject, much less a union subject. If you're saying that what about people going from one state to another to work, what about recognition of the qualifications? You have a system of recognition of qualifications. You can have standard setting mechanisms which you already have, where universities recognize one another's degree. It's not such a terrible thing. It's not such a difficult thing at all. So this notion that somehow all India is necessarily better than state deeply entrenched in many a middle class minds. I remember I used to think like that when I first went to the US to do my PhD. I came from IIT, as elite as you can get. And so you always thought IIT, wow, you call that up and all that. But you look at life and you look at the issues of democracy in the modern world and you realize we must decentralize, we must allow states. Just consider the fact that a state like Tamil Nadu has 80 million people. This is the size of Germany, France, Britain. Now, why are you treating it like a municipality? Why doesn't this qualify as a nation in a way within the Indian Union, which its own right to its own culture, heritage, language, and so on? Yes, content, absolutely. I mean, that's, one can have standard setting bodies, professional bodies, state level and national level, they can interact. All of that is fine. But you can't run the system from Delhi. You can't impose uniformity across the country on how education should be important. Although if you read the draft, if you read the policy document online, the ministry's website, it talks all about, how teachers will be allowed to encourage to develop their own curricula and all that. But somewhere in the back of all this is this promise of light but tight regulation. That's a phrase they use. Now, whether the lightness of touch relates to kind of not looking too keenly at financial misdemeanor, and the tightness refers to controlling content, we don't know. Only practice will show us which is which. But clearly, the present new education policy document does not augur well for democratic practices in higher education, does not augur well for the rights of the states and various linguistic nationalities, and it is going to significantly reduce access to what the document chooses to call socially and economically deprived section, groups, ACDG. They don't like the word caste, they don't like the word reservations, they don't like the word secularism. So many things there are many things they don't like. Although, of course, when push comes to shove, they may appoint a Dalit here as a union minister, ST there as a union, whatever, when it suits them politically. But in the document's whole thrust is to try and elide over these fundamental inequities in Indian society, fundamental discrimination practices that exist that need to be addressed frontally and that require awareness and struggle, and riding roughshod over the rights of states is not going to help you. Being silent on the question of finances makes the whole thing seem like a parody almost. At the end of the day, there are these, I keep saying, there are wonderful passages, wonderful words. You read them, you think you're somewhere else. But when it comes to nitty-gritty, you're back to square one. And they have not spelled out all the nitty-gritty, by the way. They have a section on, governance and all that, which is where this National Higher Education, HECA, Higher Education Council of India comes. You remember the old UPA draft legislation, which had this 7-member committee, so going to decide for all of India. It's called the All India Council for Higher Education, AACHE. 7 wise men invariably, and probably Savarna men more for the most part. But this is this tendency to think of a small group of highly, quote unquote, meritorious, distinguished, whatever you want to call them, individuals running the educational policies and administration of a country of India's size and diversity is simply mind-boggling. The whole exercise is top-down. What they should have done, I believe they should, at most, Government of India can suggest, what it thinks would be very valuable ways to go about higher education. Then leave it to the states, decide in their own wisdom what kind of higher education system is best suited for a particular state. I'm not saying state government are angels, right? But obviously, state governments also reflect prevailing power and property relations. No doubt about that. But at least it's closer to the people. You can take your fight to Chennai. Ideally, of course, I would prefer a system like Kerala where power is further devolved to the elected local bodies. In Tamil Nadu, for all the recent glorification of the so-called Tamil Nadu model, the sad fact is our decentralized local bodies have very little power. And so there are many directions in which State governments also need to devolve power down below. All that is correct. But in a country of our size and given the broadly, not literally, broadly linguistic nationality characteristics of states, and then a certain degree of cultural homogeneity within each state, states are the ideal units for planning higher education. For planning education at all levels, school, higher. I would say you're better off planning primary education at the local level, the decentralized local level. Standard setting is important, monitoring is important, the community has to be involved in that, but the presumption that an elite sitting at the top can prescribe for an entire country of our diversity what are appropriate practices. For me, that is, as I said earlier, simply mind-boggling. So these three defaults, these three faults, major faults, centralization, communalization, and commercialization, continue in this document. There's a lot of hot air. There's even a section on digital learning and a lot of stuff on artificial intelligence, etc., etc. Because one thing you must remember about the BJP Sangh Parivar, they, after all, have this fetish for technology. Science, they're not too thrilled about. They think ancient Indian science is far better than modern science. But technology, they have a thrill about. This is about whether it is about the bomb in 1998 or later when you declare May 11th National Technology Day. That indicates a mindset where the atom bomb is the ultimate technology. Going back to 1998. In this document also you find they talk about global standards. Global standards. What are these global standards? What are the countries they invoke? The United States, Germany, Israel, South Korea. Very significant. Very significant. You are terrified of China all the time, the US, worried about China's technological advances. Whatever China's merits and demerits maybe, I'm not getting into the debate on China. But you don't even mention the Indian policymakers do not even wish to mention the achievements of the former Soviet Union in science and technology, and how those institutions, were centers of excellence in medicine and engineering and so on. Somewhere you think the model has to come from the US, from Germany, from Israel, and maybe South Korea as a one Asian member in this distinguished list. Somewhere there is a real problem. You see, on the one hand, you want to hanker back to your ancient practices and greatness. On the other hand, you want to talk about global standards, and immediately what you talk about is the US. What you talk about is Israel. So, I mean, in other words, if you read the document, you may think I'm nitpicking, but the sense I get after reading the document a couple of times is that while this document is in terms of its rhetoric much better written than the earlier, more bulky document, in substance there is really no change. And that's not surprising, because if neoliberal policies rule the roost, how can education policy be any different? How can you have a democratic education policy that provides equal opportunities for all citizens to acquire education, or differential opportunities taking into account their impediments? How can that be consistent with a neoliberal policy-inspired regime? That is the core question. I think I have spoken for about 45 minutes, and my assessment of the normal attention span of most of our colleagues, myself included, would be 40 to 45 minutes. So even if Vinny will be slightly unhappy, I'm going to suggest that I conclude my talk now by reiterating that the new so-called national policy on education, for all its rhetoric, is firmly anchored in a neoliberal framework, envisages very little commitment, funding commitment from the state. Where it does talk about it, doesn't indicate any sources, and is highly centralized. Most importantly, it is not corporate or neoliberal policy alone, it is also corporate Hindutva policy, where it brings in Hindutva in various ways, in ways that are simply not acceptable in a secular society. I'll end there and maybe take questions. Is that all right? I'm going to end here.
Yeah, yeah, it's all right. And yeah, let's move on to the question answer session. I think things might be much clearer by interacting with our audience. But before that, thank you so much, sir, for actually detailing analytically the issues that we are going to face, or we are facing even right now. Thank you so much for that. Uh, Now the session is reaching its ഡിസ്കഷൻ പാർട്ട്. അപ്പം ഈ ഒരു സമയത്ത് നമ്മൾ എല്ലാവരുടെയും റിക്വസ്റ്റ് ചെയ്യാണ്, ഏതർ മൈക്ക് ഓൺ ആക്കിയിട്ട് സംസാരിക്കാം, അല്ലെങ്കിൽ നിങ്ങൾക്ക് അവിടെ ചാറ്റ് ബോക്സിൽ എഴുതിയിടാം. ബട്ട് ഇഫ് യു വോണ്ട് ടു സ്പീക്ക് ഇൻ മലയാളം, യു കെൻ ഡു ദാറ്റ്. Is it okay with you, sir? If
പ്രശ്നങ്ങൾ
somebody wants...
മലയാളത്തിൽ മാറാം, കുഴപ്പമില്ല.
Yes, yes.
Answer will be in English. But you'll have to help me
Okay.
understand the Malayalam question also sometimes.
Yeah, yes, sure. So തീർച്ചയായിട്ടും മലയാളത്തിൽ ചോദ്യങ്ങൾ ചോദിക്കാം, ചാറ്റ് ബോക്സിൽ എഴുതിയിടാം. പക്ഷേ പ്ലീസ് ഫീൽ ഫ്രീ ടു ആസ്ക് ക്വസ്റ്റ്യൻസ്. ഇത് കുറച്ചുകൂടെ വോട്ട് ഫൈൽ ആവാനായിട്ട് നമുക്ക് അതിലേക്ക് കിടക്കാം.
I'm looking at the chat box. Let's go to the chat box.
Can I make a point?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Athreya, for the wonderful talk, very insightful talk. Pertaining, you have already implicated to the syllabus uniformity which they are bringing in syllabus. As a history teacher, I have found that the one nation, one history type of a typological kind of an academic curriculum making, especially. But I have seen. Despite the fact that they are bringing in all these kind of commercialization of history and rejection or nullification of certain histories, especially the medieval period, as you rightly said. See, when I looked into the research methodology part of the curriculum, I have found that all these concepts and methodologies belong to the 1970s. So no work is done on that part. So basically, I doubt. See, what you said, actually that can be reinforced by saying that the ultimate aim is to bring the historical or the historiography under one umbrella. Just as you rightly said, if it's a corporate Hindu economic umbrella,
Hindutva, not Hindu.
Hindutva. Yeah, I'm sorry, Hindutva corporatization. It can also be a historicization, same on the Hindutva line in that sense. I fully concur with you. Because, what is a serious concern is that, had it been for, a worthy transformation of historiography, then they would have definitely placed the research methodology curriculum, the paper, on at least on a fair, normal footing in that sense, Secondly, sir, one question I need to ask you is that, see, when you look at the origins of the present corporatization drive, I think the most important landmark in one respect is Pitroda's national economic education policy or new education policy and knowledge commission. And second is the Ambani Birla report in that sense, Ultimately, when we cross-read into the present crisis on blended learning and all, a failed project, as it is, as far as I understand, would it lead to a kind of financial indebtedness on the part of the students? Because in US, that is a problem. Many of the students are reeling under, the pressure of, repayment of loans, things like that. So that will definitely make it a point that, the basic agenda is to bring the entire education system under, a fiscal capitalist oriented type of economy in that sense. So how do you comment to that, sir? Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you for a very good set of questions. In fact, I had this document with me. I wanted to read out from that, but I don't think I'll do that. It's too boring to do that in an online meeting. Part of the agenda is to hand over higher education. It's already predominantly in the private sector, but essentially to a set of institutions which are completely non-accountable. For example, when they talk about, for example, assessment and accreditation, they say the NAC can authorize, X number of institutions to go and assess. We know they're all seeing NAC and NAC assessments. We're all experiencing it. So they are really envisaging a huge role for the private sector, which means that in the current neoliberal atmosphere, the last thing on the government's mind would be to try and regulate the fees. They always say that you must put your financials on your website. They're not even talking about fee structures, how whether they'll be regulated and so on. So very likely students will get heavily indebted. Now the point you made is important, because from the Birla Ambani Committee on Education through the series of highly undemocratic legislations that the UPA sought to push higher education, to now, the only additionality is explicit Hindutva. The rest of it is neoliberal stuff. It's been there from earlier times. And in a sense, the Hindutva, where do the corporates play along with the Hindutva business? Because the corporates today have emerged as all India big business, right? And they are now seeking partnership with international big business. For them to have a uniform set of rules of the game in the entire country is very important. So they would not like to see too many power centers. They would not like to have the states tell them what to do. Imagine Kerala. The Kerala government didn't exist. By now your forest would cease to exist. If you didn't have a strong and ecological movement and a strong left and ecological orientation in your state, if you had left everything to profit, and profitability is the whole criterion, what would have remained of Kerala now? I mean, there's enough damage done, you might say, already. But across the country, this is the thing. So, in a sense, both the previous governments and the present government share a neoliberal philosophy, but additionally, this government uses Hindutva not out of any faith in any religion. By the way, it is not nothing to do with Hinduism. This is Hindutva is a political project. Because the majority of the country citizens are by denomination Hindus, you think that appealing to or presenting yourself as the fighter for the rights of Hindus, quote unquote, suddenly will give you a majority. So it's an attempt to work out a political majority using religion. But this says nothing about faith or any, that's beside the point. So I would say, yes, there is a continuity, and two, after the way we saw the government abandon people in the pandemic. For the benefit of students who may be there, I want to just draw your attention to one thing. The actual fiscal expenditure by Government of India during the last year and a half as a relief to people from the pandemic amounts to hardly 2% of GDP. There are lots of concessions on loans and guarantees, counter guarantees, but physical spending by the government, we should have increased demand and created employment at a time of very poor purchasing power, is less than 2%. Most of you should also know that we've had three clear indicators of a crisis in our economy for several years now. One was the continuing agrarian crisis, distress, farmer suicides, and the fact that many farmers are unable to get net income from crop agriculture. Second is the fact that National Sample Survey's own consumer expenditure survey showed that between 2011-12 and 17-18, years during which the economy recorded officially rates of growth of GDP of 6 and 7%, per capita consumer expenditure per month of rural households declined in absolute terms. I'm not talking about slowing down of growth, I'm talking about the 9% decline in the absolute amount of monthly per capita consumer expenditure of the rural household. Now, if you think this is from the rich to the poor, so maybe the rich did a little better, but the poor must have done much worse. Urban consumer expenditure rose by hardly 2% in these 6 years, which means again, bulk of the urban population have lost purchasing power. The third is the huge unemployment crisis. So you have massive unemployment, a fall in consumption power, you have an agrarian crisis that affects the bulk of your economy. Now, in a situation like that, the pandemic comes. How can the government practice austerity? They should be spending massive amounts. Why are the Chinese having a 9% growth rate this year? Because they spent massive amounts. They control the pandemic well, but they also spend money. Investments in infrastructure. European countries, US, they are spending 10-15% of GDP. They are not worried about the fiscal deficits. Why is this ultra neoliberal government in India quite happy to see people die and not try to provide adequate fiscal stimulus? to enable people to survive in this crisis. So in a sense, if a government is doing that, I don't expect it to suddenly transform itself tomorrow and spend on education. So you're right, very likely the burden will be shifted to the students. Fees, in fact, there is a passage in this document which sees student fees as a source of covering educational expenditure. Now the problem is, you see, in the university system, student fees hardly cover any part of the total educational expenditure of the system. They cannot, in the nature of things. Nowhere in the world do they do that. So you really need a not-for-profit sector in education. Yeah, the approach to the appeal to philanthropic institutions is in that direction. But in practice, it's still going to be essentially a more commercialized education system with greater student indebtedness, and soon that will lead to more problems. Of course, the pandemic itself has led to a significant decline in enrollment in higher education institutions of people from socially and economically weaker sections. That will also continue. It's unlikely to be reversed in the period to come. So yes, unfortunately, I'm not in a position to claim that no, all this will get corrected. It won't. It is, unless we transform the nature of economic policies in this country, they cannot transform the education sector. That's my clear view. Maybe necessary, but not a sufficient condition, but certainly a necessary condition. Can I go on to the next question? Is that okay?
Yes, sir, there is.
Sebastian, sir, can I continue? I'll go to Ajay Kumar's question.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you so much. Thank you.
General reaction to NEP is full of good ideas, but without any preparation, proper plan for implementation in the form of budget allocation and infrastructure. Moreover, the policy appears to promote the survival of the fittest in education. How will it affect the future of Indian education? Will it result in large-scale privatization? Yes, it will result in large-scale privatization, but more to the point, you see, when you say good ideas, it is good rhetoric. I know about ideas, a good rhetoric is there. What are nice things, like mother and apple pie, what are the things that you want to hear? But survival of the fittest, it all depends on how you define fitness, right? It is the standard social Darwinist understanding that those who survive are the fittest. Fittest in what sense? Because the system rules are tweaked to enable them to survive. Why is it that the Savarna caste do better in higher education historically? Because the whole system is tweaked to enable them to do that. Suppose you had street smartness as part of the skills you are assessing. These guys would be out of the park. So, I think one must be very careful in using terms like survival of the fittest. It's a very Darwinian, social Darwinist term that is often used by the elite. But I agree with the tone of your question. Already it is an increasingly privatized system. Let me also make it clear, I'm not saying that the state can run the education sector in this country. I think there is a significant role for the private sector. But I think there needs to be far greater and effective regulation of the private sector. And there also needs to be promotion of not-for-profit institutions, as used to happen in the healthcare system earlier. And, you had all these not-for-profit hospitals. But once the commercialization of the healthcare sector occurred, these not-for-profit hospitals also turned commercial. There's no choice. Same thing is happening in education. The old style not-for-profit colleges. After all, we all go to these colleges and speak, and we know, we just go there, the atmosphere is different. But even they are being now hurt by the general thrust towards commercialization. So, yes, you're right, Professor Ajay Kumar, that it is going to be more and more of not just privatization, but commercialization, unbridled, unregulated commercialization of education. Yes. Yes. I think Niveda wants to ask a question. Niveda?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sundar.
So, yeah. So,
Okay.
thank you. So my question is that, as we have seen, we have never reached, like, we need to allocate more funds to education if we want to, see some actual growth in the sector, like increase more access and so on. Whatever we want to do in education, we need more funds going to that side, right? But as we have said, we have never realized that even the 6%, but it is
Yeah.
not just after the liberalization, frantic. Even before that, we see that there was no much interest to invest more on education. And even after liberalization, it just becomes much worse. And in the last 5 years, it has become more worse. So since this has been the trajectory, and how do we actually change this trajectory? Like, where should the push come from if we want the state to invest more on education?
Okay, let me first of all say that there's a good point you're making, that in the entire post-independence period, Government of India plus state government allocations to education have been quite meager. But remember that up to 1975, education was in the state list. And the state governments paid some attention to primary and elementary education in the states where you had governments facing some pressure from the popular movements, like in Kerala and Tamil Nadu and so on. But even there, of course, is a very long way from where it should have been. Uh, Once you went to the 1980s, and with new education policies in the mid 80s, then the whole focus shifted much more strongly and explicitly towards deregulation and privatization. Okay, and therefore, also the notion that the state cannot afford to fund education too much, state has to cut its expenditures. I think I didn't want to do all this in this lecture because it's taking you through a whole class of economics. But once you are in a neoliberal phase, what is the main difference? Suppose you talk about the 50s and 60s and now. Now governments are afraid to run large fiscal deficits. A fiscal deficit is the difference between the total expenditure by the government, current and capital expenditure, and on the one hand, and on the receipt side, it takes only non-debt receipts. Borrowing does not count as a legitimate receipt. So what this does is to force governments to limit expenditure or privatize, disinvest. Because disinvestment gives you money which is not debt. It is legitimate money for the government can spend it. So if you can't limit your deficits, if you're forced to limit your deficits, you do that by not borrowing and meeting expenditures by selling public sector assets. So privatization gets a big boost, disinvestment gets a big boost under a regime of fiscal stringency imposed by international capital, global capital today. That's one part of the story. From mid 80s, 90s onward, that's been a part of the story. But it is not just a question of finance. I think we must bring in the other issues of one, democracy, right? We must say decentralized education. We must say involve elected local bodies. In Kerala, the participation of elected local bodies in primary education has been as important in improving the level of functioning of government schools and their facilities as has been the state's own investments. So this complementary operation of governments at different levels within the state into improving public provisioning of education through school is a starting point. Higher education, we can, we can take that up next. First, I want to make the point that even in school education, we have many, many more miles to go. And today in Tamil Nadu, as you know, Niveda, very well, Tamil Nadu, the school government education system, school system, has not been adequately funded and strengthened, and even transfers and postings, all of that, or sources of corruption. So obviously, there is a problem there. So I think there's much more than just finance. Okay, you need state governments which are responsive. You need decentralization. You need empowered teachers, students, and elected people's bodies. One of the problems we have in this national policy document is that practically all the structures that currently at least exist nominally in universities, providing some democratic space for teachers and students and non-teaching staff, all that will go. So that's another threat coming from this. Going back to your question, therefore, it is how do we ensure that we mobilize resources The only way to do it is by reversing policies of liberalization, which then means facing a lot of difficulties. It means that you're imposing constraints on capital flows, reversing deregulation and going back to re-regulation, all of that. So, that's not going to be easy because, then they will say, oh, you're going back to the old, Inspector Raj and License Raj. And this whole demonization that has taken place of
Yeah.
the public sector-led development process, import substitution, that is already there. We have to contend with that. And so, Niveda, we have to really fight on several fronts, I'm afraid.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, any other questions from the audience?
Which includes Vinny.
Yeah, I was waiting for others to contribute. മലയാളത്തിലും questions ആവാം ആർക്കെങ്കിലും. Yeah, I think somebody was trying to say something.
Yeah.
Yeah, somebody was trying to talk. I don't know. Yeah, there is.
Sujit Mohan, yes. Isn't the union government ready to establish casteism? That's a question that Sujit has asked. They're very clever. You can't put this in black and white terms. they are not even talking about caste and reservation. They're talking about socially and economically deprived groups. Suddenly they become groups, right? Not inherited disabilities from the overall caste system. I think the whole social engineering approach of the RSS BJP now is coming into the picture. Today, look at the recent cabinet reconstitution as an example. I'm not making a big deal of it, but I'm just saying. So they are not going to explicitly own up to their opposition to the democratic struggles of the oppressed castes in this country, or for that matter, women. But they may try to purchase or canvas support in some form from OBCs and Dalits and tribals. And in fact, they've succeeded in doing in several parts of the country. And of course, you now have a new entrant in the Union Cabinet from Kerala also, if you have not noticed. This is, we have one from Tamil Nadu going in there. So, yeah, I don't think that they will be so crude as to make it explicitly caste-based. But you're right in the sense that, yes, behind their approach lies an understanding that all is about social justice and all that is rhetoric. And if you just let the economy move along the liberal path, then aspirations will grow and people will then start learning and they'll find the money, they'll pay for it. No need to provide especially for Dalits and tribals and backward castes. But they won't say it. They won't say it. Yeah, it is too politically too difficult to say that. So,
Okay.
let me make one more point of that. You see, there is a contradiction there for the RSS Parivar, because on the one hand, they want to create the notion of a homogeneous Hindu population. So they need to pretend that caste differences don't matter, but we're all one, we're all Hindus. On the other hand, they also try to represent the cause of the Savarna castes by playing down social justice demands for reservation and so on. And so there is a dilemma that they're trying to address in different ways in different states based on the concrete conditions and balance of forces in each state. That's how I see it. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Any other questions from the audience? If not, I think I have a question.
Please.
Yeah. So in the document, you're talking about the philanthropic contributions, education through philanthropy and charity, sponsored education kind of thing. So we are always quite proud of the kind of system that we have here in Kerala, however flawed it may be. There are issues, but still, we are trying to keep a policy that would include various communities based on social welfare, etc., etc. And we also see, um, you know, development in the field of education on the basis of social welfare in the Scandinavian countries, and even in some Northern European spaces, there are some initiatives here and there. But since the entire policy is moving towards the highly capitalized and profitable, industrialization or industrialization of all these things, how would this philanthropical approach would affect even our own understanding of welfare? Do you think that these sense of charity that is given emphasis because of to maybe um, cover up certain illegitimate activities in other sectors would also be contributing a larger part in the section in the sector of education? If that is what is going to happen, then now we have a lot of private institutions, universities, and we hear that when, for example, Asim Premji began a university, it did include social activists and different kind of learning approaches that may not necessarily encourage the profit making act altogether. And Ashoka had a reputation until recently, I suppose. Even TIS has been standing for a long time, and we have gained scholars who are not necessarily sharing the same kind of ideology as their employee has. So when the entire idea of education itself is transforming, how would this philanthropy and charitability get transferred into the system of education altogether?
Yeah, let's get some facts, in the proportion. Philanthropy and charity can never account for more than a very, very small part of the overall expenditure on education in any country. Okay, let me make a distinction. I think there is a legitimate role for private sector in education, including the profit-driven private sector. If you recognize education as a commercial activity, you must at least have some honest regulation of the commercialized private sector in education. What we have is we don't even have that today. Today we have almost zero regulation of the commercialized private sector, which is there in education. Most of you would know from your experience that the old style not-for-profit institutions had a certain culture. Okay, they may have had denominational restrictions, they may have been catering to a particular segment of society, of religion, or of caste. Those are limitations, but they did provide education not on the basis of profit maximization. I guess the attempt of policymakers always is to, they're cutting corners and trying to limit expenditure on education to appeal to charity and philanthropy and all that. And this is happening all over the world, right? I mean, Bill Gates appears to you as a great charitable person, but Bill Gates is the one who made sure that the COVID vaccine cannot be made by a large number of producers in India. You want to keep the rights of the technology with them. Of course, on the ground that, this is very serious and you could make an error, it could be serious and so on, but whatever the excuse. So, philanthropy has always been only a marginal additionality in terms of resources, and it essentially diverts the attention of the problem from the exploitative nature of the system as a whole. So yeah, I would say that in India today, we cannot give a call realistically for elimination of the private sector in higher education. But what we can give a call is for strict regulation of the private sector operating in higher education, accountability, and of course we must also say curricular content and so on cannot be decided by money and wealth. It has to be decided on educational considerations and must be regulated at a larger level. So we need to, and also we must ensure that the rights of employees and teachers and students are respected in these private institutions, whether they are, aided or unaided. Unfortunately, the court judgments in this country also have given unaided private institutions the license to charge what the traffic will bear. So we are facing these problems. Education as a right has not gained ground in this country as an idea. I mean, there's some very feeble legislation, but that's not particularly useful. And so it's a long struggle ahead. I mean, we need to, you see, put it this way, tendency to characterize free education or free healthcare as quote unquote freebies. You find much of that in the corporate media. It's very interesting because you have a country where the wealth of the country year after year is produced by working people, not the corporates. The working people get a small part of it back as their wages or salaries. The surplus goes to the owners of the means of production. And yet your Prime Minister and Finance Minister go around saying that corporates create wealth. Corporates create nothing. The pandemic told you that. The pandemic told you that workers are not there, nothing happens, production doesn't take place. So in an economy where working people, farmers, workers, they produce the wealth, they get back a part of their output as income, they pay taxes on the damn thing, because even if they don't pay income tax, they pay a huge amount of indirect tax, GST, all of that. And yet, you call free education as a freebie. Education and health should become the rights of people, given that they produce the wealth of the country, and given that they already are paying taxes, indirect taxes. So, I think we need a complete mindset change in the notions that we have of what is free and what is, it's not even some state dispensation of welfare. Education must be regarded as a human right. So also healthcare. We need to move there. That's going to take some doing.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's almost an hour. I think if, yeah, there are questions. One more question, sir. Can you take that one also?
Yeah, I have not, Nibela has a question, but I had chosen not to look at higher education, and not to look at the school education in this class. So, pushing students to stream the standard. Yes, of course. All that is true. What Niveda has said is true, but that is not part of my topic. I mean, I was focusing only on higher education. Niveda, if you notice, title.
No, that was not a question,
Yeah,
just a
comment is
response.
correct. Yeah, absolutely correct. I mean, this is
Thank
whole streaming at all levels. Although they have this lofty rhetoric in the document about how vocationalization should not be looked down upon, and how people in the vocational stream must also be respected, same as those in academic stream and all that. Yeah, that's a great problem with this. They have all nice words and phrases, and some people can be taken in by it. But we know them too well for 7 years now, and even longer from the Vajpayee period, and even before that, the freedom movement, or their absence in the freedom movement. So I will not say anything further on this. Okay.
Okay, sir. I hope that there are no more questions. If you have any other questions, if you send it to us, we will definitely convey it to Dr. Athreya. So let's move on to the next part, an official vote of thanks. Before that, sir, as I've mentioned in the earlier part, that he has extensively given a kind of commentary on the Capital Volume One. Sir, we hope that you would come to our college, maybe by person, once the pandemic is over, and participate in a session on Marxism, contemporary Marxism theory and practice, which we are planning for the coming future. So that's all part of a plan. So we hope to get you into that session also.
Yeah.
Hopefully sooner than later, once the pandemic is over, of course. So let's move on to the next session. Vote of thanks. Lisha, is she here? Actually, it's raining everywhere, so so many people
No,
lost
don't worry
connectivity.
about formalities like what of thanks. We have about 20 or 40, 20 odd people now. Just it's fine. Go home
No,
safe.
no, wait. Ajit sir, Ajit sir, hello, Ajit sir, കേൾക്കുന്നുണ്ടോ?
He's put his microphone in silent mode. So yes, speaker
Ajit
is off.
sir,
Ajit's speaker is off. MS Ajit, his speaker is off. Get him on the phone.
well, that's quite unfortunate, but I think let's wind up this
No
session by
formality. Yeah.
extending our sincere gratitude to you, sir, for this wonderful session. You have analytically talked about the issues that you have found. I think there are more to speak on, but major issues I think have been covered. At least we were trying to address those things. And we share all these, we share a sense of um, despair when it comes to the policy change, especially in the field of education. Whatever may be the reason, maybe it's political, even self-centered reasons like keeping one's own job would definitely drive you to look into this particular area. We have had a session on NEP at the beginning of our lecture series last year, and I think moving forward here we are standing and still sharing those dilemmas that are not being resolved, and we are not even hoping to resolve it. We just have to move forward with whatever opportunities we have, and have to prioritize, I think, at the end of the day. And the entire teachers and student community would contribute to that, I suppose. But this speech was an inspiring one for us to actually think in terms of history of education, political biases, and how state would definitely change our own conceptualization of education and truth. And Professor Atri has contributed to that, if nothing else, philosophically. We are aware of certain things that are not being necessarily often talked about in our sector, especially among service organizations for a few months. For that alone, I sincerely thank you, sir. And thank you so much for all the contributors, all the scholars who have raised questions in this session. We will request you to continue participating in the coming sessions also. We are definitely putting forward important issues that matter to us in the contemporary world. Next session would be about health, and next would be definitely about development and the development economics. So both sessions will be organized by the unit on August and September. We are welcoming you for those two sessions. There will be exceptional scholars who will be handling it, probably in Malayalam. um, I think for some of our students that's an assurance. So thank you so much for all the participants. Thank you so much once more, Dr. Atreya sir,
Okay.
for coming and giving this lecture.
Yeah.
Thank you so
Thank you,
much.
Alice. Also, Alice has sent a message saying she likes the session. So thank you, Alice Clark. I can't locate you on the chat box. Okay.
Okay, let's.
Bye. I
Yeah, yeah.
can
Bye, bye.
leave now. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yes, please, please.
Thank you.